So I hope you've had a chance to actually go through and execute all of this code yourself and create this validation. And in this video, I'm just going to show you what I would do. If your code looks different, as long as it works, that's all that matters, because there's tons of different ways to write the same code. So if we just go into our index.html, the first to do we have is to add our script tag. That's pretty self-explanatory. We'll say script with a source of script.js. Make sure we defer that. And there we go. Our script tag is added. Also, you'll notice here I put in these styles for our error section. This show class allows us to actually show the errors. If we remove that show class, it's going to make the errors disappear. So now what we need to do inside of our script.js is go about all of these different to-dos. The first thing is to select all the elements we need. And here I even said just to figure it out yourself what classes and IDs you need to select, and even which elements you need to select. So let's think through what elements we need to select for this project. Obviously, we need to select the form because we need to be able to make sure that we actually are able to prevent default if we don't want it to continue. So what I want to do is just say const form is equal to document.querySelector. And now I need to figure out what selector my form has. If we just go to the index here, scroll down to our form, you can see it has an ID of form. So inside of here, we can just say an ID of form. This will give us our form element. And for now, that's enough to actually get started, because our next to do is to create an event listener for when the form is submitted, and then do all of this other stuff inside of it. So let's just say form.addEventListener for submit. And this is going to take in that event property so that we can prevent the default. And here we go. Now we have an event listener for when we submit our form, and we can do all of our validation inside of it. So now before we get too much further, let's kind of think about the next steps. Obviously, we need to do validation. We need to validate our username, password confirmation, and our terms that we've agreed to. So clearly we need a reference to all these different elements if we want to be able to access them. So we need to come in here and get our username input, set that equal to something. We'll say document.querySelector. And if we go to our index here and we search for our username, you'll notice that has an ID of username. So we can just select it based on that username ID. We need to get a bunch of other stuff. We need to get our password input, which if we come over here has an ID of password. Just like that. We need to get our password confirm input, and this one has the ID of password confirmation. I'm just going to copy this over. There we go. And we also have our our terms input. This is the checkbox here. If we come over here, we can see that this has an ID of terms. So if I go back to our script, select that by terms, we now have our username, password confirm input, and terms input all being selected. So we can do our different validation for them. Let's jump into here and see what our different steps are. The first thing it tells us to do is create an array to store all the error messages, and then to clear out any old error messages. And this makes sense. Obviously, we need a place to store all the different errors that we get to through all of these different validations. So let's just create an array here. We'll call it error messages. And we'll set it to an empty array by default. Make sure I spell that properly. There we go. And then it says we need to clear any old messages. And we have this clear errors function clearly defined here. So we're just going to use clear errors to do that for us. And in here is where we do all the code for clearing our errors. We're going to leave that for a little bit later. I want to just jump into this step, which is doing all of our validation, because we've already selected all of our elements for that. So let's define some validation. Ensure that a username is at least 6 characters. So we can say if username input.value, this is going to be our actual input. And to get a length of a string, we can just say .length. And we want to check to see if that's at least 6 characters. So if it's less than 6 characters, we want to add an error. We can say error messages.push to add a new error to our list. And we can just say username must be at least 6 characters. So now we have an error here. And let's just come all the way down to the bottom here. Just say console.log error messages for now, just to kind of see what we're working with. And also I want to make sure we prevent the default of our form. So for now, I'll just say e.prevent default. We're probably going to remove this in a little bit because we'll eventually need to let our form submit if there's no errors. But for now, we're going to prevent the default. So let's just come in here, inspect our page, look at our console, and see what happens if we just create an account. You'll notice we have an array here, and it says username must be at least 6 characters. And if we type in something that's longer than 6 characters, click create, you'll notice we now no longer have any errors. So this is our error validation for our user input, and it works completely fine. Next thing is to do pretty much the exact same thing for our password. I'll even just copy this down. Instead of our username, we have our password, and instead of 6, we need to check that it's at least 10 characters. So here, password must be at least 10 characters. There we go. Now the next thing that we need to check is to ensure that our passwords actually match. So we can say if our password confirm input.value is not equal to our password input.value. So essentially if we have two different values for our passwords, then we need to add a new error. So we'll say error messages.push passwords must match. There we go. And finally, we just need to ensure that our terms is checked. So if our terms input.checked is false, and the easy way to do that is just invert this. So if it's true, this will return true. And now, since we invert that, true will be converted to false. So if this is checked, then this is going to return false. But if it's not checked, this is going to return true. And run the code in here, whoops, where we say error messages.push, and we need to push in you must accept the terms. And there we go. That's all of our error messages complete. If we come over here and inspect this again and just click create account, you'll notice we get a bunch of errors. Username must be at least 6 characters, password must be 10, and you must accept the terms. And if we make our passwords different, you'll also see we get the passwords must match here. And this should actually say passwords must match. There we go. So now that's all of the error checking done. This entire to-do is complete. Our final to-do down here is if there are any error messages, then prevent the form from submitting and show the error messages. So we can say if error messages dot length is greater than 0, then that means that we have some type of error messages. And all we want to do inside of here is say e.prevent default, because if we have errors, we don't want our form to submit, and then we want to show those errors. And we have, a function for showing errors defined down here, which we'll need to actually create the implementation for. But you'll notice our code was a lot easier to write when we created these nice little helper functions, for example, clear errors and show errors. We didn't have to worry about how are we going to clear those errors when we were thinking about validation. We just said, okay, we'll think about this later. Then we were able to continue with this. And here we said, okay, we'll think about this later. This is a great way to just not have to worry about all of the extra complexities of, showing errors and clearing errors. You can create nice helper functions to do that. You can really focus on the important code as you're writing out your code. This is something that I highly recommend you do, breaking out these types of helper functions into their own functions instead of cramming them all inside of one really big function. So now what we can do is we can get rid of this prevent default up here, because if we have any errors, it's going to prevent default. So if we come in here, click create, you'll notice it doesn't actually do anything. But if we make our password here and make our password long enough and match, and we agree to the terms, so we complete everything, click create, now it's properly letting us through. So that's what this little check down here is doing. But of course, we have no visual indication of this. If I click create account, the user has no idea why it's not working because there's no error messages. So we need to work on that next. And because of that, I'm going to be working on the show errors message first, because there's no point in working on clearing out messages if we don't actually have any messages to show. So let's go to the show here. All we need to do is add each error to the error list element. We need to make sure to use an li as the element for each error. That's just because if we look over here, our errors here are defined as a unordered list. So we actually want to make all of them a list element inside of them. And then we also make sure to add the show class to the errors container. So essentially, if we look over at our error or our index here, you can see that we have this errors container, which is what has that show class to make it visible. We add show to this, you'll see it shows up over here. And then we also have errors list, which is where we list out each of our individual errors. This is where we add our messages essentially. So we need to select this element and this element so we can use them in our code. So let's do that all the way at the top of our page. We'll say const errors container is equal to document.query selector. And this one, we check over on our index, it has a class of errors. So we can say dot errors. Then we can say const error list equals document.query selector. And if we check over here, this has a class of errors list. We can say dot errors list. So now we have our container as well as our list of errors. So down here, what we can do is actually print out and show our errors. So we can say error messages dot for each. This is going to loop through each one of our messages. So we can say error message. So for each one of our error messages, what we want to do is create a new element, and we need to make sure it's an li. We'll just say const li equal to document.create element of li. Then I want to set the text of this li. So we'll say inner text is equal to our error message. Error message, just like that. And this should say error messages here, just so that it lines up with this variable here. They're both exactly the same. So now we're setting this to the text of our error message. Whoops. And what we can do finally is take the list of errors, which is our error list, and we want to append the child, and this child is just our li. So we're adding the li to our list. And then finally, to make sure that this shows up, let's add the show class to this errors container. .classlist.add show. So now if we click create account, you'll notice our errors are populated and it shows our error message here. But if we click create account again, it's just adding our errors over and over and over and over again. We're never actually clearing out the old errors. We're just constantly adding new errors. Obviously, that's bad. So the next thing we need to work on is our clear errors function. And this one is probably the most confusing function in the entire section of this project. So if you're able to get this on your own, that is great. And also, if you struggle with it a little bit, I gave you a little bit of a cheat using inner HTML to essentially clear out the input, but the purpose of this was to practice the while loop, so I'm going to show you both ways to do it. So the first thing we need to do is loop through all the children of the error list element and remove them. So what you could do, if you didn't want to do that, is you could say errors list.inner HTML equals an empty string. This will actually clear our errors for us. And we can see this if we create an account and click create account again. You'll notice it clears our old errors and then re-adds them, which is why you don't see new errors being added. So this is the quick and easy way to do this. And this is how I would most likely do this when I'm creating this myself. But since we want to practice while loops, we're going to be using a while loop instead. So what we want to do is do a while loop where we have some kind of code inside this while loop. And then inside of here, we need to remove children one by one. So in this while loop, all we need to do is say our errors list.children of 0 is not equal to null. Essentially, we're saying, do we have a child? Because we're getting our children and we're getting the first child and we're checking to see if it exists. If there is no first child, then that means there are no children at all, because there would be a first child if it has any children. So if the first child is null, then we exit our while loop. But if it's not null, we need to remove that child. We can say errors list dot remove child, and we're going to remove errors list dot children of 0 here. So we're just removing the first child over and over and over again until there's no more children. This will do the exact same thing. You'll see when I click create account, everything works. And if I get rid of this error, click create, you'll see it just has these errors left. So we're properly removing our errors. Either way works. I wanted you to practice a while loop, which is why I recommended you do it this way. But generally the inner HTML way works just fine as well. It really doesn't matter. Now the next thing to do is we want to make sure we remove the show class from our errors container, because if there are no errors, obviously we want to get rid of this error message. So to do that, we can just say errors container.classlist.remove show. And this is just going to hide this. You're not going to notice any difference, but if we come up here and get rid of this prevent default, if we make sure we always prevent default here, that way our page never refreshes. And if we come in here, we get some errors. And if we get rid of all these errors, just like this, click create, you'll notice the errors go away. That's essentially all this is doing here. Now, if we put this prevent default back up into here, this will allow us to just say, click create account, and it's going to bring us to this page just like we would expect. Now let's just clean this up a little bit, get rid of this console log here, and that gets rid of pretty much all of our logging, which is great. So now we save this, we have a completely working app. And again, this one was much less hand-holdy than the other ones, but hopefully it wasn't too difficult for you. Essentially, all we did is select the elements we needed, but instead of selecting them all up front, we selected them as we realized we needed them. It's hard to know what elements you need before you start writing the code. As we started writing, we selected more and more elements. Next thing we did is added that event listener on our form. We created an array to save our error messages, cleared out our visual errors, and then showed them down here at the bottom. And then in between, we populated our error messages based on all the different validations we wanted to check for. And then we just created these functions for clearing and showing our errors. But the nice thing about having them in functions is that we just, minimize this. Essentially, our code up here is much easier to read because this right here, clear errors, is very self-explanatory. But this code down here, if you read this, it takes a while for you to parse through this to realize exactly what it's doing. So having really well-named functions such as clear errors inside of your code makes it really so much easier to read than having to parse through and read all of the code itself. You can just read the function name and never have to actually read the code inside of it. And that's all there is to creating this form validation, which is something, again, that you're going to use all over the place in real-world projects. In the next section of the course, we're going to be talking about asynchronous code, which is super popular in JavaScript and something you've actually used a ton up until now, but maybe not realized it. So I can't wait to see you in that section.